Welcome to the 15th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India at the Bank of Baroda Mughal tent. We are delighted to introduce Lies, Damned Lies and Statistics. This session is presented by ABP Live. And, given the breaking news in India, this is rather well placed because a lot of statistics are bursting left, right, and center. And I'll request Shailendra to introduce our panel and carry on the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to welcome everybody to this session on data. And really the way I think of it is that it's the narrative behind the numbers, right? So the universe is made of things, but people are made of stories. And data, unless there is a story behind it, really doesn't stick. And the two people that we have on the panel today with me are individuals who've done more to shape that narrative than almost anybody else that I can think of. Let me start with them. To my right, we have Rukmini S, whom I first learned about as a presence in the Mint, which used to do and still does regular series of data analyses, often anchored by you. And I always wondered who's the shadowy presence, who says that she's in Chennai, but we don't hear much about her. Well, all that has changed. I think on the 6th of December, this book came out, and she's now a public figure in a very prominent way. And she calls herself a data journalist. I believe you inhabit a singleton set, the only member of that category in India, at least. And to my left, we have another data scientist, though not a data journalist, somebody who was with the Indian Foreign Service, and in that capacity was ambassador to Hungary and had many other positions. Thereafter was a senior official with the United Nations as the Assistant Secretary General first, and then the Deputy Executive Director for UN Women. And she has written widely on data pertaining to trade, gender, and inequality. So today, we're going to have a conversation first about the book, and I'm happy to hold it up. It's right here. It's whole numbers and half-truths, what data can and cannot tell us about modern India. So it's also about the limitations of data, right? So we will talk about the data that exists about India and also the limitations of that data. And what we've promised the organizers is that we will be brief. So I've requested each of my fellow participants here to talk for 10 minutes about the data that excites them. And I think a lot of it will come from this book, but also in Lakshmi Puri's work that she's done on the 3 or 4 areas that I just mentioned. So that will be the format. We'll have 10 minutes from each of them, roughly. And then I'll ask them a few questions. And then most of the rest will be Q&A with the audience. And I'd like to believe that that is where the most interesting part of today's session will come. So that's the plan. So with that, yes.
So it would be a bit of a travesty if we don't welcome Shailendra Raj Mehta himself. And he is the President, Director, and Distinguished Professor of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at MICA in Ahmedabad. Earlier, he headed Oro University and Ahmedabad University. Before that, he had stints at Duke and the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and Purdue University, where he taught economics and strategic management. So it doesn't get more power packed.
Thank you. So, Rukmini, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Very happy to be here and very happy to be on this panel in particular. The first thing I'm going to do, and this is staying true to my roots as a journalist whose job is to challenge all assumptions, is I'm going to push back against the very title of the talk, which is Lies, Damned Lies and Statistics. And this isn't because I don't believe statistics lie, but it is because I believe that sometimes statistics and data are held to different standards, both in terms of what they can and can't do, than the rest of the sort of material world. And I think that's problematic because it makes data inaccessible the minute we make it seem like something different from the rest of reality. So just as you can lie with words, lie with video, lie with audio, all of which we see around us, you can lie with statistics as well. And part of my mission, if I have one, definitely part of the conceit of the book, is to empower people, many of whom are frightened of numbers or do not like numbers, with the confidence and ability to access statistics and make sense of the world around them with those numbers, because that is the point of numbers, to make sense of the world around you. Having been both a data journalist and a field reporter, the book is my attempt to bring together insights from the data as well as experiences from the field that sometimes challenge and complicate what you see in a spreadsheet. And one of the things the book tries to do, and that I'm quite passionate about, is contextualizing data. So one of the things that the book does, for example, is I look at crime data, and I look at sexual violence in particular, because this is something that became an important conversation to have in 2012 and onwards in India in particular. And one of the things that I found in the book, for example, and through my news reporting, is that a large section of what was being counted in India's official statistics as sexual violence against women was actually the parental criminalization of consenting relationships, often between people of different castes and different religions. So as I say in the book, it isn't my case that there wasn't a crime going on there, but the crime was perhaps against the sexual agency and autonomy of young people rather than sexual violence as we understand it alone. Another point that I've often wanted to make around context is a timely point to make today, when all of television from 7 in the morning would have been around elections. I have big problems with opinion polls, not for the reasons that most people assume, that they are bought or that they are fake. That's not my problem with them. I feel like there's been a sort of ossification of our style of asking questions, and that has done a great disservice to Indian democracy. So in the book, for example, I talked to two women sitting on their doorsteps in Chennai as they, chatted with each other before the assembly elections this year. And the argument I make is that the Indian voter is rarely considered sophisticated. While of these two women, one of them said that she was voting for the ADMK because in the memory of the late Jayalalitha, because she was a woman in a man's world, and I know how hard that can be, the woman said to me. In academic terms, one might call it a feminist vote. Her neighbor was going to vote for the DMK because she believed that, because she counted on them to stand up for the BJP, whose values she did not share. In academic terms, you might call it a vote for federalism or for social justice. But these two women also took money from the two political parties. So you could just choose to see them as two women who handed over their sacred votes for money. And the argument I make is that a lot of opinion polling treats people as very shallow without understanding the complex decisions that go on into voting. Another point that I've tried to make in the book is that stories in particular complicate what we sometimes see in numbers, and this is important because people who deal with data shouldn't begin to see it as the holy truth, and that can sometimes happen with how we see numbers. So, for example, in the book, I look a lot at data around marriage, and this is one of those institutions that has actually seen remarkably little change over time. This is something that the data shows us. Intercaste marriage is incredibly rare in India; it's under 5%. But one of the young men I spoke to in the book was in an intercaste relationship. And at the end of the book, at the end of the chapter, I came back to him and I asked him, given that intercaste marriage is so rare in India, does this make you feel like an outlier? And he said, no, it doesn't. But he didn't feel that the data was fake or that I was lying. He said to me, that's data about marriage, madam, not about love. I think if your data asks people if they have ever fallen in love with someone from another caste or religion, many will say yes. I see that all around me among my friends. But when it comes to getting married, most of us are not yet ready to leave our families. That's why your data looks like that. So in a sense, this story sort of undermines my entire chapter, which I've tried to build with hard data, but I do concede to the fact that reality is complicated, and it's important to bring these narratives in because they, remove your sort of faith and certainty in data sometimes. The last point that I want to make is a sort of passionate appeal about access to data, particularly in India. All of, let's have fights about data. Let's all have fights about it. Let's be ideological, let's be polarized, let's disagree. But let's have that access to that data that we can then fight about. This isn't a charge that I have of the current moment or the current administration alone. I say that in the book as well, that we've had multiple examples over time of a sort of narrowing of access to data. And what I want to happen in a broader group like this is a commitment to data being seen as a citizen's right. This is our national data. It belongs to us. We'll have fights about it, but it should come to us. And the last chapter of my book talks about COVID data and the pandemic. This is a sort of running battle that many of us journalists have had with the government over the last year about access to data around deaths, around COVID deaths. And I just wanted to bring home the point about why these numbers matter. Behind these statistics is the story of what undercounting means. In May 2021, 32-year-old Rinku Parmar tested positive for COVID in the 9th month of her pregnancy. Within 2 days, she began to sink before her husband Manoj's eyes, and he got her admitted to a private hospital in Silchar, Assam, where they live. The baby boy was born by C-section because she was already so sick that she had to be put on a ventilator. 3 weeks later, without ever having held her son, she was gone. Yet her death certificate did not mention COVID. The hospital said that it was nearly a month since she had tested positive. The most recent test was negative. And so the district administration had told them not to count such deaths. I had to tell my 5-year-old daughter that her mother had died of COVID. Manoj told me over the phone, her husband. To think that she didn't even count is an insult to her memory. So in a sense, this is what numbers are trying to do. If we are not able to guarantee people dignity in life, at least in death and in statistics, we should be dignifying their presence. So this is where I make my argument for access to data being something that all of us across the board, across ideological divides can agree is our right, and then let's fight about it.
So what a lovely thought. And I'll just add a minute worth of observation on this and then
Sure,
to
please,
you, Lakshmi.
Please.
India actually produces a lot of data. The amount of data that there is in the census, for example, each census is humongous. Village level data. In other words, the census actually finds out whether each village has a school, a hospital, a playing field, a well, irrigated. So we have 600,000 data points for each of these questions. And we've taken up a project which visualizes all of this. Literally, every school child in the country should be able to click on her village and find out, what are the 60 parameters for that village or neighboring villages, and do it for a district as well, 60 major variables. So we're trying to follow exactly your thoughts. That is, how do we democratize data?
Absolutely.
So we'll hopefully release this very soon in every Indian language, 60 indicators for every district, each one of the 700 districts in the country. And hopefully in a very easy to see, consistent format, the latest data available on 60 variables. So with that, let me now invite Lakshmi Puri to contribute her point of view.
Thank you, Shailendra, and congratulations to Rukmini for this, trailblazing on data journalism and the book, which is an excellent book and opens people's minds to something that is traditionally seen by most people as inaccessible in terms of understanding or relevance. So congratulations for that. Let me begin by quoting my favorite poet, T.S. Eliot. Where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? And in relation to data, I may say that in this 21st century, where is the information we have lost in data? So this pyramid of beginning with data, information, knowledge, and wisdom, and as a contribution to policy making, decision making that you refer to. And what you have also revealed in your book is how through data gathering and netting, you're also scoping, you're taking the temperature of social attitudes and behavior, and eventually you're also shaping that. So in that sense, but I am both a data skeptic and a data believer. And, as Einstein said very rightly, that not everything that is counted counts, and not everything that counts is counted or gets counted. And I think what you have also proved is that counting, the how of it, the what of it, is what makes it count, right? So I think that's something that you have brought out very well. I would also like to agree with you that it's important to check out information, methodology, authenticity, verifiability, but also who produced it, why, what it missed, and what is the other side saying. So, the point that maybe I'll come back to that a little later, but I think it's important to note that when I share your angst that why is data also, getting social and political spins and interpretations and insulated, why cannot be insulated from political and social pressures? But can we, in a country like India, which is vast, populous, federal democracy, politically contested, culturally diverse, can we ever have such cauterization of data? So this is something that I would like to leave that thought. And it comes through. And the other point I want to make is when you make your point about tolerance and the data on tolerance in India and elsewhere, I want to make a very firm point that the templates that we use for the West and measuring what happens in India cannot be juxtaposed, because they will, and you have proven it by giving the example of Europe, where there is a higher dissatisfaction with governments, whereas there's much more optimism and support in India. So this is something that I wanted to also highlight. Because you see, if you juxtapose this, then it gives a reductive picture of India's extremely sophisticated heterogeneity, syncretism, pluralism. And that's been the result of thousands of years of cultural intermingling. I also wanted to say something on the importance of what you have also to reinforce what you have said. It's necessary to establish more rigorous standards and contextual templates across the data life cycle, from planning to design to collection to netting to mining, now the big data mining, and to analysis, reporting, evaluation, and using that for monitoring. So this is something that I do. But of course, in the era of big data, we are also looking at concerns about privacy and the use of data. So we very much look forward, Rukmini, to your people like you, and may there be more, really giving us what could be the reform processes and ways of capturing the authentic data and procedures. Now, I am convinced, like you, that better data will show a truer picture of India and more accurately, and as you were trying to do through your district level lenses, that it will reflect both the short-term gains, for example, and the long-term benefits of the new India that, for example, the policies of Modi government are bringing about. Now, just a few words on, I want to say that I'm not a data scientist. I've been someone who's been overseeing, and driving gender data or in different areas. I've been advocate, I have been a user, but I beg to say that I'm not a data scientist. But I think we need to know that across the world, 2.5 quadrillion bytes of data globally are collected. But in terms of gender data, it's a tiny, tiny fraction of that. So, and what is not counted will not be prioritized, and what is not prioritized will not be done. Secondly, women and girls constitute 50% of any population, India included. And if you don't count the lived realities of that 50%, then what is the value of your data? So, and count it in the right way, as you have rightly pointed out. Because the deficiency of data is actually, gender data is a reflection of gender inequality. It's a symptom of gender inequality and also contributes to it. So just to also quickly recall that there is in the Sustainable Development Goals, there is the Sustainable Development Goal 5, which has 9 targets. And we work very hard in UN Women to get together 14 indicators and get an agreement of the international community on 14 indicators. But for 80% of those indicators, we have no data. Not only in India, it's a global issue. Whether it is non-discriminatory legal frameworks, proportion of women in managerial positions, gender land holding, bank accounts, asset ownership, access to modern methods of family planning, sexual and reproductive health and rights, crimes against women, domestic violence, you have highlighted all that, sexual violence in particular, equal wages, labor force participation, but also what is women's work, paid, unpaid, and care work. That's not been counted, and we have been pushing for that. And the sex ratio at birth in India is particularly important, child marriage. So all these elements, we have to have ways in which to capture this and fill this void that is there. And then there are also certain, as you have pointed to, socio-cultural norms that often means that females in households are not asked questions. They're not represented or given a voice when opinions and information is being sought. And most often, elderly and unmarried women, girl children, domestic help in the household tend to be missed. And very importantly, women-headed households have been left out in many cases of the data collection process entirely. So these are some of the, the issues that we need. And we need a whole of sector approach, both standalone gender data systems, but also a shift of approach to engender all data. For example, your data that you are collecting from the districts, it should have a gender lens in collecting. And it's also, I agree with you, it has to be accessible to women because women are both the consumers of data and the generators of it, and also evidence-based advocacy and decision-making. Just a word on the fact that, at UN Women, we had this big project with private sector partners and philanthropic groups like and member states to make women and girls count, that project, to actually do this, to make gender data real, comprehensive, and substantive, and promote, truly drive the promotion of gender equality and women's empowerment.
Thank you. I'll pick up a point that you just made and just contextualize it. You mentioned data for monitoring, right? It's going to be extremely important. Now, historically, think of the empire that Chandragupta Maurya built, right? It's unprecedented in human history because it was either the largest or the second largest empire built up to that point. And it was in contention with the Achaemenid Empire in Iran, right? Now, what is interesting is that the empire that Darius and Cyrus and others built was built over 3 generations. Chandragupta Maurya built it in 1. How did he do it? One major part, 2 major things that I'll point to. One, he built a road called the Uttarapath because he had 2 capitals, Patliputra and Takshala, so that you could connect. That is National Highway number 1 today, folks. That is what is called the Grand Trunk Road, not built by Sher Shah Suri. He repaired it, but it is built by Chandragupta Maurya. So one thing that he does is he builds the infrastructure. The second that he does, he puts in an administrative structure to collect data. And he has specific officers which do that. He collects data on gambling houses, on prostitution, on land revenue, everything is collected. And that is the reason why he's able to build something which is unprecedented, a great empire in 1 generation. That is number 1. Number 2, another interesting factoid that I learned from the work of Professor Amartya Datta, who's a professor at the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta. He mentions that the whole notion of statistics was, now think about it, where was statistics born? The chances are if the West has not written about it, it was not born there. And oddly enough, it was born here in India, the science of statistics. How? It is actually in Aryabhatta, because he was given the problem by the king to find out the volume of these ponds that were all there, right? Because they had to be refilled and they had to get a sense of drainage into and out of those ponds. Now, these ponds were naturally existing ponds they were not regular polygons, right? They were irregular shapes. And the depth of the pond was different at each point, right? So you could have a huge pond. How do you find out how much water it has? So Aryabhatta comes up with a technique that he divides it into a grid, and then he takes a depth measurement at one point in the grid. And then he takes a weighted mean. The idea of the weighted mean was not born in Greece. It was born in India because the idea of statistics is very unnatural. When you're looking at means, you're throwing away data, right? You're taking the mean to stand in for the whole population. That is a very unnatural operation. And Aryabhatta was the first person who did it. So we don't know these little things about our own tradition, but this is what made the Indian civilization what it was. So with that contextualization, let me ask you to talk a little bit more about one of the most outstanding things that you have in your book, which is right in the first chapter, that you looked at 583 cases of rape. Tell us about that. That's a fascinating story. You know, it almost made my hair stand on end. Would you like to talk about how you came across that statistic and what it tells you?
Thank you. Yeah, so a lot of my job is looking at official statistics.
Yes.
And one of the things that I do like to repeat is that India's official statistics are awe-inspiring and impressive in their scale, in their breadth. There's no reason for sort of blanket suspicion. There's good reason to be skeptical of everything, not just official statistics. But when something does go wrong, we do know about it, by internal systems as well as through the work of journalists. So official statistics are very impressive. However, there are some areas that we know that statistics miss, not out of manipulation or choosing to get things wrong. And I do think that this is an important point to make. So in 2012, I lived in Delhi at the time. And along with the rest of the city, the country, particularly its women, I was deeply vexed by the sexual assault that shook the city in December 2012, and very much wanted to be part of the conversation that happened in the weeks and months afterwards. However, having been a journalist on the ground in Mumbai years earlier, where as a rookie reporter, I was sort of dispatched to every corner of the city, I knew how things worked on the ground fairly well, especially how they worked in police stations. So it bothered me that all of these assumptions about safety were being made on the basis of police statistics, given the fact that I knew that what goes on in the police station across the country is deeply problematic. I knew that an FIR note, counting it as the building block of police statistics by assuming that it's the whole truth is a problem. So in order to move beyond police statistics that I felt were not giving the full picture, I decided to look at court rulings.
Yes.
Because this gave me a richer data set in terms of not just the decisions of courts,
Yes.
but also the paperwork that went into it, being able to speak to both the accused and complainants and prosecutors, and being able to speak to judges who were deeply vexed at that time by the fact that there was so much conversation about a low conviction rate, and the judges wanted in a way to be able to put out what they were seeing in the cases that came before
So
them.
say a bit about this cold drink laced with a sedative. I mean, that is so striking.
Yeah.
That's a standard formula that is used in all these FIRs.
Yes. So one of the things that happens is that the police are not particularly imaginative. They have worked out some systems that work before judges. So with sexual assault, for instance, you need to be able to show that there was that consent was vitiated. Now, this is a legal term, but before the judges, you need to show that the woman did not give consent. And if this is a consenting couple, to show that consent was vitiated, you need to show either abduction or intoxication, where consent is not something the woman can give. As a result, cops across the country, because I did this in Delhi, in Bombay, and in Madhya Pradesh, have worked out a system that if they say that the woman was offered a sedative-laced cold drink and then was abducted, it shows that her consent was vitiated by being intoxicated. Now, when I read these, and they were faithfully reported in in the newspapers, which essentially, crime reporter's job, unfortunately, in most of the country, is to faithfully report police handouts. So when I read this, I felt like there was some sort of epidemic of sedative-laced cold drinks in Delhi. And I was actually scared for myself when I go to Lajpat Nagar to shop. Do I need to worry about this being in a shop? Because that is how the FIRs and that is how the news reporting made it seem. So by going through these, I decided that the data didn't exist. So I had to build this database. I kept the Delhi District Court's website open as a tab on my computer and chipped away at it for 6 months on the side. And I looked at all trials in Delhi's 7 district courts in one calendar year. There were 600 in all. And what I ended up finding was that of the 460 cases that were fully argued before the courts, 189 of them dealt with consenting couples. In which the parent or the uncle or the grandfather had decided to essentially criminalize love.
Interesting. Let's open up. The most interesting part of the session is the dialogue. I see hands going up. Can I see a show of hands? I see the gentleman here. Again, I'll follow the lead of the predecessor here, my predecessor here, who said a question in 1 sentence, please. No speeches.
Cool. So you talked about contextualizing data, right? And we're storytellers. We tell stories because we like to put data in context, but it also simplifies the narrative, right? So what's a tip for people to contextualize data? At the same time, you embrace the complexity of the story, right? And we know that we're both scared of data, but at the same time, we use data to tell our own stories with our own biases and all that, right? How can we be more careful and contextualize it while embracing complexity?
Such a great question, and really something I struggle with a lot, because having been used to working with data, I actually, the number one feedback from editors in the country to data journalists is humanized data. Anybody who works with data gets told this a lot. And I do see the point of it. I love stories. I love telling my children stories. I love hearing stories. I love talking to people. I really enjoy talking to people, and I have found I enjoyed putting the stories in the book, and I do find that they resonate with people. Most people remember the stories in the book rather than the data in the book. But this is an ethical compromise and a difficult question to answer. In a sense, what you're doing, you're being unfaithful to the data in a way by picking out one story, because those are moral and ethical decisions. Whose story do you tell? You're saying that you're representing a data set of 1 lakh households, and you've chosen to tell one person's story because you have decided that they are representative. They are difficult difficult decisions. And I think one of the things I've tried to do is use stories that actually don't confirm what the data says, to sort of, because one of the things I think journalism sucks at in India is flattening out reality. You get this sort of completely shallow understanding of Indian life. You cannot have an uninteresting conversation with an Indian, right? You'll invariably hear something fascinating that you'll relate to your friends. I ended up putting them in a Word file called extras on my desktop instead of using them in my stories, because that was a sort of template of journalism that I was following. So part of what the book tries to do, and part of what I hope a lot of us who deal with these questions can do, is to use extras in our stories. They might not be telling us, that one representative story, but they tell us about a more complicated and a more interesting reality.
Any questions from the lady here in yellow?
Hello, thank you. Lovely session. Was a lovely book. I did read it, definitely. And two things come to my mind. First was that when I was reading your book, and much before, even in my work life, there is this website called gapminder.org. Hans Rosling's work, amazing work, where he's telling the world how to look at the world through data, but he also says how to collect the data, right? So there is a narrative there. And my question is, therefore, not about Hans Rosling, but whether such work can be put for us, where we can actually go to such a website and look at whatever data we want, and then go to the source. Because even when you're reading words, we normally look at where are these words coming from? Whose opinion is it? Even when you pick up a book, I see who is the publisher. Is there a vested interest in what this book is saying? So in a way, I think my question is, how does one look at the source of a data? Biased, unbiased, it's all in the head. But if we just have the access, what are the tools that you are thinking of putting together so that we can access this?
Can I take it briefly and then pass it to you? Because
Yeah.
I know you have interesting things to say
Yes.
about it as well. So this is actually one of the great bright spots to me of the last couple of years in India, which is that this push towards an open data community has really taken over in India, and it's brought together a sort of collaborative community of people who are not all journalists or even data practitioners. Many of them are young people who work in tech, for example, in sort of for-profit jobs in the day, but are deeply public-spirited and want to, bring this data out and help people with access to it. Many of them are people who work in government, but have this commitment to open data. So one of the examples of it, one of the great sort of success stories is COVID-19india.org, which was a sort of volunteer-driven effort that popped up during the pandemic, and now COVID-19bharat.org that takes it on. So these communities exist to make this data, and all of it is, meticulously sourced. It would be absolutely anathema to put out data in these communities without giving full access to it. And just to add one more, another point, one of the things that we did with our excess mortality reporting during COVID, for example, journalists like me who were able to access civil registration system data from various states, we made sure that we put it all up on a website called GitHub, where it is freely available to people. This wasn't just a sort of nerdy quirk. It was with this ethos that you are free to make up your mind about this. You might not feel that there is excess mortality in India, but you should know how to access the data, and you shouldn't have to take my word for it. This era of oracle journalism, the sooner it dies out, the better. And one of the things that will help it die out is access to open data, where people are free to look at it and then they can make up their own minds.
So actually, ma'am, let me give you a website. I wasn't planning to plug it, but since you've asked for it directly, it's called mica-mimi.in, mica-mimi.in. The latest data about India is there, and you can download small sections of it. If you want to download the whole database, then you have to subscribe to it. But you can generate maps and all of that there on the website. You can do that. You want to add something, Lakshmi? No, but generally.
I want to say that the world's largest data gathering exercise is on, the census.
Census, yes.
And that is where we really need to all, provide inputs and work with that process. We also, I have looked at some of the global systems that are there. I think we have one of the most elaborate and extensive architecture of data gathering in India, which we should be proud of, but which is, by the way, is getting aligned increasingly also to global standard setting, and is contributing to global standard setting, because the UN Statistical Commission, of which we are a member, has this role of, towards sound, robust, comprehensive data gathering and analysis. So I think that aspect really needs to also be taken into account. How do we also train people in these institutions to better gather? And that's why I would, as I was saying earlier, I want to challenge people like you who are in this whole data science game to really find the best training modules, the best kind of questionnaires. It's the whole thing. And it's not only gender data, but the entire spectrum of the intersectionality aspect.
Yeah.
If you are in a rural, remote area, if you are poor, if you are not educated. So what are those disadvantages if you are disabled? So to capture all of these, the granular aspects of the data, I think it's really important for data scientists and activists like you to work with the national institutions. And you too.
And one,
I know you are doing that.
one important point to just pick up on what you've just mentioned, the new census is digitizing everything. One of the problems with the last census was that, for example, the migration data was published 8 years later, right? By which time the pandemic had already started. I wish all this data was in the public domain, because the census actually tells you how you move, which district were you born in, where have you relocated, literally district to district. So all this is now hopefully going to be very, very quick in terms of the turnaround time. Other questions? Yes, sir, right there. The gentleman there in the black t-shirt.
Hi, we today have one linking pin, which is the Aadhaar number,
Yes.
which links together many giant databases like the census, right? Income tax, health records, driving license, land ownership, you name it. So I was wondering, is there any kind of action, any kind of movement to layer all these databases using this linking pin and come out with new insights?
Very interesting question. Would you like to take that? Well, I think it's going to be very, very interesting, because they're taking Aadhaar and then they're linking everything else to it, right? Your PAN number, your bank account details, your mobile number. And now I believe there's a new card that you can get, the Aabha card. I got one. If you have an Aadhaar number, this is your health card, right? So you can literally tell all your laboratories who do your blood tests or your COVID tests, or even your medical records, they can all be integrated. And by the way, I can tell you, as somebody who dealt with this in the United States peripherally, because we were doing so much work with Homeland Security, that it's a complete mess in the United States. They are nowhere near integrating all of this, which now has been done at the touch of a button in India. Everything is integrated because the whole platform exists, right? So believe me, amongst all the doom and gloom that we talk about, there are huge rays of hope in terms of digitization. And India is one of only 2 countries, Thailand is the other one, where literally at the touch of a button, you can send money from any bank to any bank without any intermediary. You don't have to go to WeChat. You don't have to go through Alipay. You don't have to go through the 3 or 4 middlemen that you have in the United States. It's completely decentralized. So the opportunity to build on top of it is huge. Yes, ma'am, right there.
Hi, thanks for an excellent session. My question is to Rukmini. I have worked a lot on data. So its data journey travels from prioritization to data collection to analysis of the data. So I have a question. If you have a magic wand, considering the India's complexities and data challenges, what would you like to fix it?
Your one wish. But what data did you miss in your book that you really wished you had?
Actually, the data I missed was not from official sources. The data I missed was from big tech companies. I absolutely could not get access to data from Google, Facebook, dating websites, e-commerce. this is, an enormous source of data. We are voluntarily handing over so much of our personal data to these companies, and virtually no access. The access to it comes in a very curated fashion to, tech journalists typically. So there have been some improvements. Google mobility data is one of those things that played an important role in pandemic analysis. But yes, I would love much more access to big tech companies.
By the way, let me make a plug for a paper that came out by Professor Chinmay Tumbe, who's here in the front. You have a paper in Nature, right, that just came out. So what they've done is that they've looked at a panel that one of the polling firms in India basically put together. So it's a for-profit database, but it's been made available to researchers free. And they use that to answer many COVID-related questions. So I think that is the kind of panel data that you'll need to put together, that people in the private sector will need to put together for marketing purposes. And then it can be opened up. So other questions? I think we have room for two more. Yes, sir, right there.
Hi, this is for Rukmini. There seems to be a gap between Indian policy making and data collection. There's also there's almost a struggle between that. Do you agree or disagree, and why?
I have limited agreement because I do feel that there's actually, there's a good conversation on data going on in policy spaces. Government data is made accessible to people in policy. One of the areas that I find, worrying is that why did we begin as a country to collect data? It was because it was meant to give inputs into planning. And there was a great deal of sort of almost ideological purity or nationalism, if you can call that, in our data architecture, in our statistical architecture. It was meant to feed into policy and planning. So the questions were open-ended. Let's see what the data shows us, and then let's build policy for it. My worry with this growing ideological polarization around data is that when a major data set comes out now, it's seen as a sort of referendum on politics of the years before that. And as a result, the bad incentives that it creates in terms of questions around the collection of the data and definitely around the release of it or the lack of it in some cases is a very dangerous place to be in. So I think if we can, sort of reorient that conversation, try to think of the moment of independence and the architecture we were building then, and try to think of it really as data that feeds into policy in the manner that you're describing, rather than purely being seen through the lens of conflicting politics. That would be a much better point. I don't think I've directly answered your question, but that's the bigger problem that I find right now.
So I see a lady right there with her hand up.
Hello, good afternoon. This is a twofold question for the entire panel.
Just one, please.
Yeah, but it's a twofold question, so it depends. It's in one sentence. I've edited it especially for you.
Okay.
Okay, so.
Okay, I'm impressed.
Right. So you had mentioned, Rukmini ma'am, that if we pick out the outlier in data and do justice to it, there's a possibility to have more truth in our data. Or something along those lines. So like we do justice to, we don't flatten the data. So is there also some chance of creating some kind of value or standard for the amount of bias or societal bias or corruption that is there in the society that we could work on and work into our data sets? And the second part of my question is for my students who are UX designers. They recently came up with a very shocking example of how police can actually change up the data according to those in power. So I also wanted to know, that how in a world which is being run by big data and where our UX designers are being taught to create user touch points and KPIs and data points for big data companies, how are they supposed to get over that cynicism of being both a sieve, which is collecting that data and being part of that data machinery where they're also—
Your one sentence is over.
Yeah, selecting it.
Sorry, I'm going to answer quickly and then maybe we could talk more later. So to your question around thinking around doing justice to outliers and not and accounting for bias. There are good ways of doing this statistically to build models that look at bias. So for example, a young developer who I know is working on measuring degrees of bias in opinion polling. And the point is not to point fingers, but it's to do a better job of looking at this data for the future. When you look at that polling agency, you can discount perhaps, as they do in the US when they build models around it. There's that. And then there's also the act of storytelling. And, you can think around how you can complicate reality or sort of account for bias in the storytelling part of it. How about I leave the harder question to the rest of the panel?
So I think we'll pass on that because we've run out of time. So I think in the next 1 minute, the first thing, of course, thank you so much, Lakshmi Puri, and thank you so much, Rukmini S, for a wonderful session. And let me close by a very interesting quote, again about Chanakya. If you've not read this political thriller called Mudra Rakshasa, you may want to look at it, by Vishakha Datta. There, Chanakya is suspecting Chandan Das, who's a businessman, a very successful businessman, of treason. And he wants to sort of feel him out. So he asks him a data question. So the question that he asks of Chandan Das in Prakrit, he asks in Sanskrit and Chandan Das replies in Prakrit, but the question is, Katham Vriddhi Labhaha. He asks, how's business? He says, so what is your revenue increase? Give me your percentage revenue increase and your percentage increase in profits. That is the question that perhaps Mr. Forbes, who's right here, may ask his managers, right? So that is the question that Chanakya asks Chandan Das to put him on the spot. It's a data question and a very important one, which indicates his whole orientation towards economic activity. So thank you very much indeed for a great session, and a big hand for our panelists here. Thank you very much.
We would like to thank Rukmini S, Lakshmi Puri, and Shailendra Raj Mehta for a fabulous session here. And also we'd like to thank ABP Live for their support. Coming up next is Chats with the Dead. Also to keep you posted, Rukmini has her books. So grab your copies and she'll be signing her books right here at the author signing desk. Thank you very much. कहीं भी कभी भी किधर भी कैसे भी सही वाली जानकारी जानते रहो मेरी भाषा में हो skip the FOMO let's roll and know जानते रहो सारा जानते रहो ABP लाइफ के साथ जानते रहो है तेरी बारी स्वाइप फॉर जानकारी कैसे नेता देश चलाते जानते रहो कैसे सेलेब बाल बनाते जानते रहो लेटेस्ट टेक ये कहां से लाते जानते रहो लोग आजकल किधर को जाते जानते रहो कहीं भी कभी भी जानते रहो किधर भी कैसे भी जानते रहो सही वाली जानकारी जानते रहो मेरी भाषा में हो skip the FOMO let's roll and know जानते रहो सारा जानते रहो
ABP लाइव ऐप डाउनलोड करो और जानते रहो।
जैसे ही कोई पशु अपंग होता है तो हर चीज के लिए स्ट्रगल करना पड़ता था, चाहे दूसरे एनिमल्स के लिए, चारे के लिए, पानी के लिए, जीवन जीने के लिए, चलने के लिए, खड़े होने के लिए। एनिमल जो डिसेबल होते हैं वो ह्यूमन बीइंग की गलती के कारण होते हैं, चाहे वो स्कूटर से एक्सीडेंट हो, चाहे मोटरसाइकिल से एक्सीडेंट हो।